Red's Fly Shop, this is Bob. How may I help you today?
Look at that. Woo! Nymphs. I'm Joe at Red's Fly Shop. We're gonna have a little Riverside chat today on all the different types of nymphs that you might use on trout streams. There's certainly nymphs that live in still water like damselflies and dragonflies and lots of different mayflies or hexageneas. We're just primarily gonna talk about how to choose a good nymph and some thoughts on nymphs for your trout fishing. Now the first fly I showed you there, that's a stonefly nymph. We'll take a look at that. It's got 2 tails, 2 antennas, 6 legs, anatomically correct. Stoneflies are gonna be kind of one of your #1 go-tos anywhere from the Rocky Mountains over to the West Coast. Stoneflies on this river behind us are probably the trout's #1 food source. We have about 6 different stonefly hatches on this river. So a stonefly nymph is just a great place to start. Stonefly nymphs are going to range in size anywhere from on the very small end like a yellow Sally all the way down to like a 16 or a 14 all the way up to some super jumbo stuff like this all the way up as big as a #4, and that would imitate a salmon fly, and you can see that dynafloss jointed leg there moves and works really well. In general, with the exception of the golden stonefly nymph, which is going to be much more of a lighter tan color, tannish olive, most of your stonefly nymphs are going to originate in that kind of that black and brown color scheme. We have a stonefly called the Yakima River Summerstone here, which is somewhat unique to our region of the West, and it's a very, very dark color. And I like those silly stones, of course. But one thing I really like is one of these jiggy patch stones, and I'm going to show you a side profile of that. And that's one of my favorite stonefly patterns for almost anywhere I go. And you can see that it's got really nice symmetrical leg patterns. I think that's very important on your stonefly nymphs. And this one has a jig style hook. So when that thing sinks down and hits the bottom, and then I put a little tension on it, that jig style hook hopefully lifts the fly just up off the bottom rather than my tippet getting caught around a rock or something and snagging. One thing I do like to do to these with the real bright colored legs like that is I will take a Sharpie marker and I will put variegations on a lot of my stonefly nymph legs just to create that, well, 2 ideas, well, 3 ideas really, but segmentation and then movement. Something that's checkered or looks a little static, has a little pattern to it, naturally looks like it's moving when it's not. Imagine yourself looking at a television and you've got the ant races on there of just black and white. If you just at a glance, with all that black and white and patterning, sometimes it looks like it's actually moving static and it's not. So I think that patterning and that variegation works really well. Some stoneflies will come with variegated legs. I generally will choose my patterns based on profile and then the weight. You want to have a variety of different weights to your stonefly nymphs. Some of the ones that I have like this Pat's stone, that's just your classic Pat's rubber leg. That one's barely weighted at all. It sits suspended really nicely. It sinks very slowly, and I could use that in some slower areas, and it will still levitate and move with the natural kind of ebbs and flows of the water column. And then some of the other ones I have, like a TJ hooker. Here's a TJ hooker in the light color. That thing's got a tungsten bead, and I believe it's also wrapped with a little lead. This one's going to sink very, very quickly and get down in some of those rural, swirly, mixed, bouldery areas. So it's very important to have a few different weights as well as colors and sizes for your stonefly nymphs. But you really want that fly to look like it's moving when it's not. So what I don't have in my box is a lot of the old-fashioned like Kaufman stones and stoneflies that have real stiff rubber legs that don't move naturally in the currents. The TJ hooker having a marabou tail, that one's got to be mentioned again, and that's that black and coffee color. But and I'll even wet that down, but that marabou right there ends up moving, and that looks like it's almost articulated in the water. So even this is only like a number 12, it fishes much more like a number 6 stonefly because that tail actually looks like the articulated portion of the body. So I think you want to have a variety of different stonefly nymphs. The Pat stone is really the classic of all time. I fish that one a lot as a squala stone. That's just the number 10 olive. But the stonefly, because of the fact it lives in rivers for 2 to 4 years at a time, at any given moment in the river, there's going to be a big variety of different sizes and colors of the stonefly nymph. So for the western half of the US, that's going to be a very, very relevant insect. Now, the stonefly is a great place to start. A lot of you watching this video, you're probably wade fishing. It's my favorite from a do-it-yourself standpoint. Wade fishing is that's kind of where I find my peace and quiet, and I get to wade, and it becomes the quiet sport all of a sudden because I don't got a buddy or a guide nagging at me to mend or row harder or whatever it is I need to do. So when it comes to wade fishing, a stonefly it's a great starting point, but I think a lot of do-it-yourself anglers have a huge miss when they get reliant on just simply wade fishing with a large fly, because the large fly has a lot of presence when it enters the pocket, bucket, hole, dump, ledge, slot, trough, whatever water terminology you want to use. The stonefly has a lot of presence, so I really encourage wade fishermen. You're going to spend, I would say, 90% of your time kind of in this range right in here. And I'm just going to pick out kind of favorites at random. And this is going to be, the specific name is a TNT PMD. It's a jighead nymph with a little tungsten bead in a number 16 size. Now, just the concept of where you're going to spend your time, what flies you're going to choose, I'd say like 80 to 90% of your fly selection should really be in that number 14 to 18 range. So that's kind of where you're going to start, because this fly, I can slip this into a little pocket behind a boulder, and maybe I don't get the drift right the first time, or maybe the fish is distracted and looking at something else, or I had a little drag or didn't get it deep enough, or I hit a rogue current and kind of wash around them. I can fish a number 16 over that fish numerous times without really telling them like, hey, I'm here, you're under fire. So most anglers, especially on foot, are gonna seek to fish flies that are a little bit more stealthy. So hatches are going to be, I hesitate to say like you're always going to match the hatch, because frankly a lot of these flies, they're just little tiny jigs is how you want to think about them. They're going to have certain fish are going to have certain tendencies during certain hatches or on certain days, but you really are going to find or need to find a handful of flies that you know and trust. You know how fast they sink, you know how they fish, and you have confidence in them. And you can fish like that PMD bug. I fished that during Baetis hatches, caddis hatches, and all sorts of different hatches as well, but you're going to spend most of your time there. When it comes to your flies, having some different weights of these small nymphs in that size range is going to be really important. For my fast water scenarios, there's one called the meathead right there. And the meathead has a red tag on the back, a very large bead up front, and that's the one I use to really get down in a situation where I really do need to cut through some fast currents or possibly get a little bit deeper. And I'll show you a handful more of these kind of these general attractors. This one's going to be called a mouse. Actually, that's not a mouse jig. That's a gosh, I think that's called a violet. That's by Fulling Mill. I'll just tag it in the product video. But that's got a nice CDC hackle on it. Again, it's got a hot spot right behind the bead right there. And that again is just going to be a general attractor. And when it comes to those flies, a lot of the ones we sell are actually going to tell you what the bead size is as it goes from 18 to 16 to 14. And some of the more technical nymphs, are going to actually offer multiple bead sizes in the same hook size. So the 14 might be available in a 2.8 millimeter tungsten bead, and then it might also be available in a 3.3. And I think having that weight balance is really, really critical. We'll just run through a couple of other patterns here. This is a March Brown jig. And I use this during a lot of caddis hatches. Even though it's called a March Brown jig, again, you don't always have to match the hatch. Caddis are very busy hatchers. When they emerge, or they're busy emergers, I should say, when they elect to go to the surface and emerge, they are very busy. And that hackle and that loose dubbing on there is going to create the idea of a lot of motion. And so that one has been very successful for me on a lot of different hatches, but it's a March Brown jig during a caddis hatch. Let's move on to a red tag. And so this is an example of one that's available with an extraordinarily large bead on there. Now, the large bead isn't always to get deep. and that's a Rosa's red tag. I think that should be in everybody's box. And the large bead on there isn't always necessarily to get deep, but when fished under an indicator, and we'll talk just lightly about indicators on this video here, when fished under an indicator, if that bead can anchor that indicator in and put a little down tension on it, the large weight or large bead and that additional weight of the fly actually stabilizes the drift quite well. You could imagine an unweighted fly, which we'll talk about, and there are times to use unweighted nymphs as well. An unweighted nymph has a lot greater tendency to just kind of wander around rather than anchoring it in. And if it's unweighted, the indicator, if the indicator is too large, then the indicator is just doing all the driving, and it's just dragging this nymph around haphazardly, and it's just looks like a drunken teenager trying to drive for the first time. So it's just going to be all over the place, and it's going to be wandering around. This bead right here will anchor this in, say it's 18 inches deep, 3 feet deep, whatever it is. The larger the bead will provide stability, especially in swift currents. So that's a Rosa's red tag, and that one does come with a much larger bead size. So there are a few others. The yellow spot, if you follow the channel or follow us on Instagram, you'll see I promote the yellow spot a lot. That one's got tooth marks all over it. That's got a very soft CDC hackle, so that thing emulates motion. Even in slow currents, that CDC hackle is going to work extremely well. If I'm fishing in slick water where there's like meandering foam lines and a lot of wandering currents and slower water, anything with CDC on it is really going to move very well in that slow water, and it's going to create movement in a situation where a simple flash pattern or loose dubbing might not be able to sell that idea of movement to the trout. So yeah, we'll talk about unweighted stuff here in a moment. Let's talk again about just a different style of nymph altogether that was really made popular in the Czech or Euro nymphing community, and their pursuit of finding more and more effective patterns that, you know, one, catch fish, that's like the first prerequisite, but two, sink fast without a lot of additional junk on the fly. And a lot of these Perdigon style nymphs, a Perdigon is going to be a very, very streamlined, kind of stripped down nymph, often with flash, floss, or marabou, that even has a light epoxy coating over it, typically with a slightly oversized bead. And the thing about a Perdigon, because it's so slick and streamlined, it sinks very, very quickly. And that's really important for somebody who's tight line or contact fishing. Very, very important for it to get down very quickly. So the Perdigon nymph has kind of been the rage over the last 5 years. And there are lots of different Perdigons out there. This happens to be a blue diamond Perdigon that I'm showing you here. Now, the fascinating thing about Perdigons is they were created for contact fishing, so they sink down fast. We make contact with the bottom, and if they are to lift off the bottom, they get down quick. But when we run these Perdigons suspended under a strike indicator, we get the same effect. It's like a bullet, and that's actually the name of one of our best-selling nymphs, is a Spanish bullet. But that Perdigon is going to be your fastest sinking fly amongst all the flies that I've showed you. So if you're in pocket water or technical currents, or you're fishing a little cubby hole along the bank and you need that nymph to get down very quickly, a Perdigon is going to aid you in getting down very, very quickly under that strike indicator, or under maybe a hopper or a chubby Chernobyl if you're suspending a nymph underneath that chubby Chernobyl. Now, most of what we talked about has been like swift water, Western style, pocket water type nymphs. There's a whole nother line of nymphs that I think is very, very important to have, and we're just going to talk about unweighted nymphs now. Now, unweighted nymphs, there's nothing that imitates a suspended mayfly, especially, that's working towards the surface to hatch, like an unweighted nymph, because that fly is going to sit and give the illusion of a very neutral buoyancy. They also work extremely well in unison on two fly setups. When you have a heavy fly and a light fly, and maybe you want that light fly to kind of wander around and give some natural illusions of movement underwater. And that's just a flashback pheasant tail that's non-beaded. And I'm showing you a little bit larger one, that's a 14. And it's just a non-beaded nymph, and I think that's incredibly important for the two scenarios that I described there. But this fly is extremely important in those slower current situations, as well as running it in unison with a very, very heavy fly. One of my favorite systems, especially for contact fishing, and we'll use the next fly. I'll talk about a crane fly larva here. A very heavy fly on a contact rig where I want this fly on the floor. I want that to be tapping the brakes, and I want whatever fly it happens to be. It could be a stonefly nymph, it could be a heavy perdigon. But this fly is going to go down, tap the brakes, and touch the bottom. And then this fly, I will actually suspend a few feet off the bottom, and it casts really nicely because all of my terminal weight's on the very end of my line, which does a wonder in minimizing tangles and making me a more accurate caster with the nymphing setup if the terminal weight is exclusively on the end. So there's definitely a place in the box for non-beaded flies, especially flies in clear water or picky fish or heavily pressured fish. I think you need to make sure and carve out a little space for those non-beaded flies. The other fly on the non-beaded front, and of course you're going to have that, it's just a flashback pheasant tail. There's nothing fancy there. That's my go-to. It's been around forever. No reason to reinvent the wheel there. This is a little itty bitty, and it happens to be one of the only sizes I have in there, so I'm going to do my best to hold it steady and keep it in focus. But that's a partridge soft hackle with a peacock body. And that fly has great movement in still water. It still works in fast water. I use a lot as a tag fly in unison with a weighted fly. And then when I have a very, very picky fish that's feeding on emergers, I can throw this right behind a little dry fly so that I can track it. And this fly will float just a couple of inches under the surface. Many, many times you see those very selective fish feeding. You think they're feeding on dries. They're actually feeding just under the surface, and you're really just seeing that back of that tail or even just a boil or a swirl, and they're eating those vulnerable nymphs that are just subsurface. So the partridge soft hackle is always going to be in my box, along with, and I happen to have some bigger versions of this, along with that hare's ear soft hackle, and you can see all that crazy partridge hackle on there. Makes for great movement and fishes very well when it swings up at the end. And again, I can just run this as a slightly submerged dry fly, a floating nymph, or a flimp, if you will. I even put a little floating on the wing sometimes when I have a really challenging rising fish that is in slick, flat, clear water that I can't fool. The next thing we'll talk about kind of some of the junky stuff, all right? So we'll talk cranefly larvae again in a second, but heck, let's talk worms, man. Worms are a real thing. Trout love worms. Don't ignore it. You're matching the hatch. Don't let your friends shame you and bully you for fishing a San Juan worm. Now, worms, there are times, especially in the spring after a big rainfall, and that's a wiggly worm from Fulling Mill. It's got a bead built into it. Works great under a dry fly. Works great under a yarn decatur, which is by far my preferred way to present a nymph if I'm not going to get a fish direct or in contact with a nymph. But worms are very important, especially after a big rainstorm, a dark day, a damp day. There are times in the spring when those fish just absolutely have to have worms. They will swim around stoneflies to get worms. I'm not sure why. I think there might be something in the worm, like a mineral, that the fish just says, hey, I need that. But they absolutely love San Juan worms. Times not to fish San Juan worms: stagnant, clear water, times when there's not any erosion or turbulence in the water, when the water is extremely clear. The San Juan worm is not going to be nearly as effective. And you can get that in a variety of different colors, pink and red. Light pinks, I don't like the bubblegum style pink. The reds are historically been my best and most productive worm. Now, one thing that gets really overlooked is going to be a cranefly larva, especially for those of you that are running a tight line rig. And I know that thing looks crazy bright green, but you put that thing in the water, it darkens up a little bit. And in the springtime and wintertime, that cranefly larva is a very, very important food source for the trout. And that's one thing I overlooked for years. And this is actually a mop style fly, so that abdomen can move and move freely in the water. And once it's wet, it really has a movement of its own. Cranefly larvae are best fished in very slow, weak insides. So like an inside bend, that's where those cranefly larvae, they don't crawl well, they're like a grub. They just seem to get rafted and wind up on those inside bends. I've done lots of screening in the river and picked those up, and it's always going to be on those soft, weak inside bends as well. So that's your cranefly larva. You can get them in grays, tans. This one right here is also a mop style. They can fish under an indicator, but I think they fish better under a tight line rig. But that orange one is the one that I fish in the fall as an October caddis. I'll start fishing that in late August and September, and I'll do extremely well for October caddis on that mop style October right there as well. Let's move down in size just a little bit, and I'm going to show you another family of flies, and they're going to be a little bit harder to get you to show up on camera, but I'll tag a few, and you can click the fly links in the video description to learn more. But we're going to talk about midge patterns, and that's just a little itty bitty guy. That's an olive zebra midge with a little tungsten bead. And the zebra midge is one that you have to have, no matter if you're on a giant river like this or your local creek. The zebra midge is very important. Have a couple of blacks, have a couple of reds, as big as 16s down to about 20s. And the zebra midge is one that people think about it just as a midge pattern, but there are lots of little micro mayfly nymphs in the river that are so small that little legs and tails and stuff are just indecipherable. But the skinny profile and the wire segmentation on this bug really does a great job of earning the trout's trust. I fish these in extremely clear water, late fall, winter, early spring, when the river is gin clear. I do extremely well. And you can actually fish these tungsten ones, the ones that are linked there, sink very quickly. I run these typically on a 6X fluorocarbon, very light tippet. We'll talk just generally about tippet selection and a little bit about strike indicators as we wrap up the discussion here. But you want very light line to these zebra midge, and I'll just fish this by itself, suspended under a yarn indicator. I think that works fantastic. You can fish it as a tag behind or even above another fly. I did promise myself I wouldn't get too into nymph rigging because that's like a whole different topic, but when I fish under indicators, most of the time I would run a heavy fly and a little fly in a tandem rig adjoined at the gape of the hook there. There's lots of different ways to do it. I've done videos exhausting the possibilities on that. When I fish a contact style rig where I'm tight line nymphing or contact nymphing, Euro nymphing, whatever the hell you want to call it, I will run my anchor fly or my heavy fly down, and then I will run this 18 inches up off a little tag on the outside. So depending on the style that you're using, style of presentation you're using, I would run one setup versus the other setup.